Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army.
Thank you. It is really great to be here for this one.
Yeah, I'm super excited to get into this because, usually when you start looking into the origins of these major institutional shifts, right, like a complete paradigm change in social work or the founding of a massive charitable movement, you kind of expect to find this really pristine origin story.
Oh, absolutely. You expect a boardroom.
Right. You picture this boardroom or maybe wealthy 19th century philanthropists sitting in these velvet-draped parlors.
Sipping tea.
Exactly. Sipping tea, writing these extremely large checks and drafting, very polite, highly academic charters for the betterment of the poor.
Yeah, that's the standard narrative of historical reform. We are completely conditioned to expect a top-down phenomenon.
Totally.
Like the idea that respectable society, the educated elite, they look down from their vantage point, identify a problem, and systematically just hand salvation down to the masses.
Because it's clean.
Right. It's clean, it's organized, and it's deeply rooted in this almost aristocratic view of charity. I mean, we like our historical reform movements to feel orderly. We want them driven by logic and, adequate funding.
But then for this deep dive, you step out of that parlor and you walk down to the docks of 19th century New York.
Yeah.
And suddenly that pristine boardroom just shatters completely.
It really does. It's gone.
Yeah, we are looking at a historical landscape that is, to put it mildly, murky. We're talking about a world covered in grime, smelling like stagnant river water and cheap rum.
Very cheap rum.
Right. And the architect of this massive social shift we're exploring today, he isn't a wealthy aristocrat at all.
Not even close. I mean, we are examining what is essentially the absolute definition of a paradigm shift from the gutter up.
Yes, the gutter up. I love that phrasing.
It's accurate. And our source material today is this fascinating collection of excerpts from the book, Jerry McAuley, An Apostle to the Lost.
Such a powerful title.
It really is. And it's crucial to establish right away for you, the listener, that we aren't just looking at a traditional historical biography today.
Right. It's more than that.
Way more. This isn't just the story of a man. We are examining a literal masterclass in grassroots organizing, in peer-to-peer rehabilitation, and in the raw sociology of reaching the exact people that polite society had officially stamped as unreachable.
So let's actually dig into who this man was, because the central paradox of this source material is just genuinely staggering to me.
It's wild.
It is. How does a man who is literally described in our text as a dock thief, a former convict, this highly dangerous character who is officially deemed, quote, unfit to be at large, how does that specific individual end up pioneering a rescue mission movement?
A movement that eventually spawned over 100 institutions worldwide, no less?
Right. You simply do not go from being a terror on the waterfront to a global pioneer in social intervention without this massive internal and tactical revolution.
You don't. And to really understand the mechanics of the movement he founded, you have to understand the psychological weight of the environment that forged him.
Tell me about that environment.
Well, the text paints a very vivid, unforgiving picture of Jerry McAuley's origins. I mean, he wasn't just a petty criminal who made a few mistakes. He was a river thief.
Which is a very specific kind of criminal.
Exactly. In the context of mid-19th century New York, the river thieves were among the most hardened, violent elements of the city's underbelly. They operated at night, out on the water, dealing in stolen cargo.
So they're constantly evading or fighting the harbor police.
Constantly. It was this cutthroat, brutal existence. You had to be ruthless to survive it.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the text uses the phrase unfit to be at large, which is such a chilling bureaucratic designation.
It really is cold.
It tells you everything you need to know about how the authorities viewed him. He wasn't a project to be rehabilitated, right? He was considered an active threat to the social order.
Totally unredeemable. As unfit to live as he was unprepared to die, according to the text.
Wow. Unfit to live.
Yeah, and that designation is exactly why his eventual transformation is so profound. But the catalyst for this change, it's almost shockingly casual.
It wasn't some huge cinematic moment.
Not at all. It wasn't a sudden strike of lightning. The source describes him attending a meeting during something called the John Allen excitement.
Which is like a local revival thing?
Yeah, a localized religious revival. And Jerry's internal monologue, there isn't some immediate, profound spiritual awakening. The leaders just ask whoever wants prayers to stand up.
And what does he do?
He simply reasons with himself, and I quote, well, them fellas can't hurt me praying for me, so he stands up.
It's almost flippant. Like he just figures it couldn't do any physical damage to him.
Precisely, just a shrug and a whatever. But that initial, almost apathetic curiosity is what cracked the door open for him.
That's fascinating.
But what really sets Jerry apart, and what became the fundamental cornerstone of his absolute authenticity out in the streets, is how he related to his past after he began to change.
Right, because a lot of guys would brag about it.
Exactly. The text explicitly points out that unlike some reformed individuals who, quote, revel in the recital of their past sins as if they were heroes returning from battle.
Oh, I hate when people do that.
Right. Well, Jerry refused to do that. He remembered his past with deep penitence and visible pain.
That makes a lot of sense, actually, because it removes the ego from the equation entirely.
It completely neutralizes the ego.
It's like a superhero who actually hates his origin story. You know, he doesn't want to go around bragging about the vat of toxic waste he fell into that gave him his powers.
That's a great way to look at it.
He doesn't want to sell action figures of himself falling into the sludge. He just wants to stand by the vat and stop other people from falling in because he knows how agonizing the mutation process is.
That is a highly accurate way to conceptualize the psychology at play here. He wasn't glorifying the toxic waste because in the world of reform, especially in the 19th century, there was often this huge temptation to capitalize on your former notoriety.
To make a name for yourself.
Yeah, to use your worst deeds as a badge of honor to prove how far you've come.
But let me challenge that for a second. Because in that specific era, you know, the era of P.T. Barnum, of dime novels, of massive public spectacles, isn't telling a gritty, sensational backstory exactly what draws a crowd?
It absolutely does.
Right, people are naturally drawn to the sensational. Wouldn't leveraging his notoriety as a dangerous river thief have given him a massive platform? I mean, did his reluctance to brag about his crimes actually make him more effective on a practical level?
What's a very valid skepticism, and frankly, sensationalism does draw a crowd. If Jerry had billed himself as the terror of the docks now tamed, he would have packed tents.
People would pay to see that.
Oh, for sure. You'd have curious onlookers from the upper classes who just wanted to gawk at a reformed monster. But you have to look at the specific mechanism McAuley used to build his institution.
What do you mean?
A crowd comes to be entertained by a former thief telling wild stories, but a community of broken people is only formed when they look at a leader and see someone who shares their shame, not someone exploiting it.
So it's the difference between building an audience and building trust.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Building an audience is easy. Building trust with outcasts is incredibly hard. The text notes that tears would literally run down his face when he spoke of his past.
Wow, that's raw.
That raw, unvarnished sorrow is what allowed him to bypass the natural, heavily fortified defenses of the hardened men and women he was trying to reach.
Because they could spot a fake a mile away.
Exactly. When he stood in front of them, they didn't see a showman getting a gasp from the audience. They couldn't accuse him of being a hypocrite. His pain was visibly real.
And that established immediate, unshakable credibility with a demographic that was just naturally suspicious of anyone trying to save them.
100%. Which leads directly into how that internal transformation dictated the physical spaces he eventually built.
Right, because Jerry didn't just want to be a good person in private. His change immediately manifested into a tangible vision.
He was a builder at heart.
He wanted to build something real. And this brings us to the architecture and the completely unconventional methodology of what we can call the McAuley playbook.
Yes, the text gives us a very specific blueprint of Jerry's vision, and it is entirely informed by his lived experience on the streets.
He didn't want a standard church, did he?
No, not at all. He specifically envisioned a house of the Lord with a bath, a chapel, and furnishings. And this vision became a reality. In 1872, he started his work, and by 1876, a 3-story brick building was erected at 316 Water Street.
Right in the heart of a notorious area.
Right in the thick of it.
The inclusion of a bath in that initial vision is just brilliant to me. It's such a glaring departure from standard religious architecture.
It really is.
I mean, you don't walk into a cathedral and expect a public bathhouse, but he mandates it right up front.
What's fascinating here is that Jerry had this innate practical understanding of holistic rehabilitation. He recognized a sociological truth that the polite charities of his day completely missed.
Which was what?
That physical dignity must often precede or at least accompany spiritual renewal. I mean, you are dealing with people who are, as the text describes them, ragged, defiled, fresh from the prison or the gutter.
Right. They're in absolute survival mode.
Exactly. To invite them into a pristine sanctuary without offering them a way to clean themselves physically is to completely ignore the reality of their daily existence.
Almost insulting.
It is. The bath is a profound functional symbol of washing away the dirt of the streets before you even begin to ask a person to address the state of their soul.
It's applied empathy. He's essentially communicating, I know exactly how you feel right now, and the very first thing you need isn't a lecture, it's a safe place to wash off the grime.
Yes.
And the environment he created inside that building at 316 Water Street, it was entirely engineered for the exact population the rest of the city had discarded.
You see,
The source material specifically highlights his methodology, too. It mentions his downright sincerity, blunt presentation of truth in familiar language, and nightly meetings 365 days a year.
the pacing alone is staggering.
Every single night. There is absolutely no off-season for the Water Street mission.
That consistency is the backbone of the entire operation. Nightly meetings without interruption meant that whenever a person hit rock bottom, whether it was a random Tuesday in November or Christmas Eve, the doors were open.
They didn't have to wait till Sunday.
Exactly. And the blunt, familiar language cannot be overstated either. He spoke their dialect.
Right, he didn't use academic theological jargon.
No, he used the vocabulary of the docks, the prisons, and the streets. He created a psychological safe harbor.
What really strikes me is how the text describes his approach to individuals. It calls them hand-picked souls.
Yes, handpicked.
To me, it's the difference between artisanal farming and commercial harvesting. You know, Jerry didn't just stand on a soapbox in a square and yell at a crowd, hoping somebody would casually listen and convert.
He didn't just cast a wide net and hope for the best.
Right. He believed in the slow, deliberate, incredibly labor-intensive work of picking souls one by one, taking hold of an individual, looking them in the eye, and walking them through the process.
And he proved that this labor-intensive method worked so well that he eventually decided to expand his footprint.
Oh, the move to Cremorne.
Yes. In 1882, he moved to open the Cremorne mission at 104 West 32nd Street. And the text reveals his reasoning for this move, which tells you everything about his strategic mindset.
Why did he choose that spot?
He went there because it was surrounded by 6th Avenue dives. He evaluated the landscape, decided it was, quote, a worse place than Water Street, and specifically chose it to target the area known as Hell's Kitchen.
That is insane to me. He actively sought out the worst possible real estate.
He really did.
He looks at Water Street, decides it's too stable now, and asks, where is the absolute worst neighborhood in the city right now? Oh, Hell's Kitchen. Great, let's pack up and go there.
He ran toward the fire.
But surely that created friction. I mean, how did the conservative, respectable society of New York react to all of this? You have this former convict setting up shop in the most dangerous neighborhoods in the city, demanding a bathhouse in his church, and operating completely outside the traditional, polite ecclesiastical structures.
Well, as you can guess, the initial reaction was characterized by grave distrust.
Naturally.
The text notes that many conservative Christians looked at his methods, the blunt language, the raw, unfiltered environment, with undisguised contempt.
Undisguised contempt. That's harsh.
It deeply offended their sensibilities of how religion and charity should be conducted. They thought it was chaotic and inappropriate.
But I'm guessing that changed.
It did. The turning point, as it always does in these historical shifts, came down to undeniable results.
The proof is in the pudding.
Exactly. You can debate a methodology in a parlor all day long, but you cannot argue with a transformed life standing right in front of you. The real proof of this unconventional method wasn't the brick building itself. It was the sheer volume of people who walked out of those doors and never returned to the criminal underworld.
Which naturally brings us to the actual engine driving those results at the Water Street mission. Because the operation wasn't just Jerry lecturing a room full of people every night.
No, it was much more dynamic than that.
The source text makes it incredibly clear that the primary tool of the mission, the real structural secret weapon, was the power of the peer-to-peer testimony.
This is the core sociological innovation of the entire movement. The text explicitly states that the practical preaching of the gospel of salvation was done through the personal testimonies of the saved.
It's all about the lived experience.
Yes. And it offers this brilliant analogy. It says, a blind man whose eyes have been opened is a better advertisement for a doctor to other blind men than a whole volume of theoretical essays on blindness and its cure.
Oh, that imagery is incredibly powerful.
It really crystallizes the concept.
Because you can hand a guy freezing in the gutter a perfectly written, peer-reviewed academic pamphlet on why chronic drinking is destroying his liver.
But he's not going to read it.
No. But if another guy who was passed out in that exact same gutter yesterday walks up to him, entirely sober, clean, and says, I was where you are, and I got out, that bypasses all intellectual defenses. It is undeniable proof of concept.
In modern sociological terms, we refer to this as the concept of credible messengers.
Credible messengers, I like that.
A credible messenger is someone whose lived experience matches the population they are trying to reach. The mission democratized the space completely. Let's look at the specific examples the text provides, because the variety of the demographics is just astounding.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The testimonies documented in the text are just gripping.
They read like novels.
They do. There's the Swede who spent his youth smuggling. He literally lost his brother to the smuggling trade.
A tragic backstory.
And the text says he was convicted of sin while aboard a ship called the Black Adder in the Shanghai River, of all places, after he had challenged a man to a fight.
Now think about the specific demographic that story reaches. A rough, hardened sailor. A smuggler who has seen global violence, who has experienced profound personal loss with the death of his brother, and who is operating in international waters.
That's a very specific guy.
It is.
No.
And when he stands up in the mission and speaks, that reaches directly into the transient nautical population of the docks. A refined minister from uptown simply cannot speak to a smuggler the way another smuggler can.
It's a completely different language.
Exactly. Then you have testimonies that are incredibly practical, focused on the gritty reality of everyday economic choices.
Yes, the story of the man with the paper collars. This is perhaps my favorite detail in the entire source.
Such a great story.
This man bumps into an old drinking buddy on the street, and the buddy offers to treat him to a drink.
A huge temptation.
But instead of taking the liquor, the man says, I'll take a box of paper collars, as I need some, but no more rum for me.
That detail, the paper collars, it requires some context for us today because it is so grounded in the reality of 19th century urban poverty and the desperate desire for renewed respectability.
Right, because we don't use paper collars anymore. What exactly were they?
Well, paper collars were a cheap, disposable way for working-class men to look presentable. They simulated the appearance of a clean, stiff linen shirt without the prohibitive cost of actually owning linen or paying for laundry.
Oh, so as a way to fake it till you make it visually.
Basically, yes. By choosing the paper collars over the rum, he is literally choosing dignity, hygiene, and social participation over the oblivion of the bottle.
That's amazing.
It's a tiny economic transaction, but it represents a massive psychological shift. He is investing in his own future respectability.
And then, on the complete opposite end of the societal spectrum, the text gives us the story of the Southern lawyer.
Talk about a contrast.
I know. This guy was highly educated, a graduate of the University of Virginia. He was a prominent lawyer who became a hopeless drunkard through social drinking at college. He was completely disowned by his prominent father, lost his home, lost his wife.
A total fall from grace.
And where does he finally find his salvation? Sitting in the parlor of the Water Street Mission, sent there by his cousin.
This highlights the radical democratization of the space we mentioned earlier. Inside the walls of Jerry's mission, the university-educated aristocrat from Virginia is standing on the exact same floorboards as the Swedish smuggler from the Black Adder and the local dock worker choosing paper collars.
It's the great equalizer.
It truly is. They're sharing the exact same physical space, and more importantly, they are sharing the exact same narrative of ruin and recovery. Addiction stripped them of their social classes, and the peer-to-peer testimony rebuilt them as equals.
When I hear about these nightly meetings, 365 days a year, where broken people stand up in a room and say, I was a drunkard, a gambler, a thief, and this is how I got out, it strikes me that Jerry McAuley essentially invented the structure of modern group therapy.
He really did lay the groundwork.
More like an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. But this is happening decades before those concepts were formalized in medicine or psychology. He built this purely out of instinct and spiritual conviction.
He identified a fundamental truth about human nature long before the clinical terminology even existed. And that truth is that shame isolates, but shared vulnerability connects.
Shared vulnerability connects. That's profound.
When the text says that men and women were taught that their wretched past did not make decency and respectability impossible, that message was delivered by the very people who had achieved it. But, your comparison to modern formula systems raises a critical point about the long-term viability of this grassroots model.
Yeah, that's exactly where my skepticism kicks in.
Let's hear it.
Because realistically, relying purely on people with zero administrative background, fresh off the streets, to run an institution, I mean, that sounds like a recipe for total chaos.
It does sound precarious.
Right. An anecdotal success story is great. The guy taking paper collars instead of rum is a heartwarming story. The Swede on the Black Adder is highly cinematic. But can a movement built entirely on peer-to-peer storytelling actually scale into a sustainable global institution?
That's the big question.
Doesn't it eventually collapse the moment the charismatic founder dies? Doesn't it eventually need to become that pristine academic boardroom to survive?
That is exactly what the traditional charities predicted. They thought it would fold. And you're right, in 9 out of 10 cases, an intuitive founder-led movement shatters without its charismatic leader. It just collapses into a cult of personality.
So what happened here?
Well, the historical record here answers your skepticism definitively. The model didn't just survive Jerry McAuley's death. It acted as a massive incubator for future leaders. It proved to be structurally robust enough to multiply exponentially.
And that phase of the story, the incubator phase, is fascinating. Because the text notes that Jerry died, or, as his wife Maria beautifully put it, he slipped into heaven.
Which is a deeply poignant way to frame it.
It is. But the work didn't stall for a second. Maria McAuley stepped right up and led the Cremorne mission for 8 years after Jerry passed.
And this is where we see the critical transition from a personality-driven mission to a systemic engine of leadership. The specific mechanism McAuley used to prevent collapse was that he didn't just save people, he actively manufactured new leaders.
He empowered them.
Exactly. Look at his successors. We have John F. Shorey, who was converted at Barnum's Hippodrome and took over Water Street. And even more illustrative of the model's durability is Samuel H. Hadley.
Samuel Hadley's trajectory is the ultimate proof of concept for the incubator model.
It really is.
The text says he was saved at Cremorne under Jerry and Maria's instrumentality. He goes from being a despairing outcast hiding in the crowd to, 4 years later, becoming the superintendent of the Water Street mission itself.
The student becomes the master.
Literally. He took the reins of the movement that pulled him out of the gutter.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is the sheer brilliance of the McAuley model. In a traditional charitable model, the wealthy benefactor runs the charity, and the poor remain the perpetual recipients of the charity. The hierarchy is fixed.
It never changes.
Never. But in Jerry's model, the recipient becomes the benefactor. The patient becomes the chief of medicine. And it wasn't just men running the main missions either. This methodology spurred massive institutional offshoots.
Let's talk about the Door of Hope, because the scale of these offshoots is wild. The text talks about Mrs. Whitmore, who founded the Door of Hope after visiting Water Street.
She was just a visitor initially.
Yeah, she and her husband went down to the slums just to see what was considered the greatest wonder of the Fourth Ward. And she was so moved by the peer-to-peer model that she started her own institution, specifically for lost women.
And the most compelling evidence of Mrs. Whitmore's offshoot is the story of a convert named Delia.
Oh, Delia's story is incredible.
The text describes Delia as a former terror of the Mulberry Bend. Now, for context, for you listening, Mulberry Bend was one of the most notoriously dangerous, squalid slums in New York history.
It was infamous.
It was a labyrinth of tenements, rampant disease, and organized crime. So Delia is saved at the Door of Hope, and before she dies just 11 months later, she is instrumental in bringing over 100 souls to the mission.
Let's actually pause and think about the logistics of that for a second. 100 souls in 11 months. That is roughly one new person she is personally bringing in and mentoring every 3 days.
It's an exhausting pace.
Where do you even find them? You have to go into the alleyways, build trust, navigate the violence of Mulberry Bend. The sheer relational energy, the hustle, the intense dedication required to do that while you're just newly recovering yourself. I mean, it's mathematically and physically mind-boggling.
It perfectly demonstrates the viral geometric growth rate of credible messengers. Delia knew the exact people of Mulberry Bend. She knew their language, she knew their fears, she knew the specific alleys they were hiding in.
She had the map.
She did. A refined, highly educated missionary from uptown could have spent 10 years walking through Mulberry Bend with a stack of pamphlets and not reached 100 people. Delia did it in 11 months because she was one of them. She possessed absolute street-level credibility.
If we stretch our earlier analogy, the Water Street mission operates exactly like a modern tech startup accelerator, but for high-stakes social services.
I can see that.
You come in completely broken. You get seed funding in the form of grace and basic physical dignity, like the bathhouse. You want to go intense daily peer mentorship. And then once you are stable, you are sent out to launch your own startup mission, like a Series B spinoff. You were expected to scale the operation yourself.
That analogy holds up structurally very well, and the demographics of who was operating inside this accelerator continued to be wildly diverse. The text mentions Mother Sherwood, who spent years working with colored people, sharing the space.
The diversity was unmatched for the time.
And incredibly, it mentions two men who frequented the mission who later actually became governors of the state of Connecticut.
That detail is wild to me. I mean, what does it say about the psychology of human nature that wealthy, politically connected men who go on to govern a state were drawn to exactly the same gritty, unpolished room as smugglers, dock thieves, and former gang members from Mulberry Bend?
Well, I think it reveals a profound psychological truth, which is that moral and spiritual destitution does not discriminate by class.
That's a great point.
The polished executive or politicians suffering in secret, they need the exact same fundamental intervention as the visible outcast sleeping in the gutter. The blunt sincerity of Jerry's method completely stripped away the societal camouflage.
It forced them to be real.
It forced the future governor to realize he was internally no different from the Swede or the Southern lawyer. The leveling effect of raw, undeniable truth is intensely magnetic to anyone who is exhausted from living a lie, regardless of their tax bracket or political standing.
So this startup accelerator of a mission starts claiming massive, undeniable numbers. The text notes that the movement claimed to have inspired over 1,000 rescue missions, directly or indirectly.
1,000. Just think about that scale.
And that ripple effect didn't just stay confined to the physical slums of New York. It eventually penetrated entirely new, highly specialized environments, like prisons and oceans.
This is where we see the supreme, scalable versatility of Jerry's blueprint. The core philosophy, the blunt truth, no judgment, meeting people exactly where they are, it was universally adaptable. And we see this brilliantly executed in the expansion to the maritime community.
The Sky Pilot mission boat, I love this part. It wasn't just a physical brick building anymore. They actually put the mission on a boat out on Long Island Sound.
Taking the mission to the water.
Yeah, and the text gives these great specific details. The boat featured a blue pennant with a white cross. They held daily services at colors when the flag was raised or lowered, and crucially, no collections.
That's a huge detail.
They specifically mandated that they weren't passing a collection plate to a bunch of underpaid, broke sailors.
The Sky Pilot is the ultimate logistical execution of meeting your target demographic in their own context. You don't ask the sailor to leave his ship and navigate the city to find your church. You take the sanctuary directly to the anchorage. You adapt the architecture to the audience.
It's brilliant marketing, honestly.
But perhaps the most profound expansion of Jerry's influence mentioned in the text is the prison outreach.
This part is fascinating because Jerry is no longer doing the work in person at this point. He's not standing in a room crying. The text talks about physical copies of the book, Jerry's life story, being placed in prison libraries.
The power of the written word.
And there's this specific account of a highly educated prisoner working in the library. He reads the book, and he has this exact realization. He says, if God could do that for him, he could do as much for me. He ends up pardoned and later visits the mission in New York.
The genius here is utilizing the printed text as a form of asynchronous mentorship. Jerry McAuley was literally mentoring inmates from beyond the grave.
Wow. Mentoring from beyond the grave.
Think about the sensory and psychological environment of a 19th century prison. It is the ultimate form of isolation. The prisoner in the library feels his life is permanently over, that his criminal record defines his entire identity forever.
Just as society once defined Jerry as unfit to be at large.
Exactly the same.
So, what does this all mean? To me, it likens the distribution of this book to an open source code for redemption.
Open source code, I like that.
Once the code is written, the highly specific algorithm of a dock thief finding grace, it can be downloaded by a prisoner sitting alone in a cell, or a sailor anchored out on the water, or someone halfway across the globe.
It transcends geography.
Right. The text mentions W.H. Smith founding the Helping Hand mission in Auckland, New Zealand. The code works anywhere because the human condition is the same anywhere.
That's a really strong assessment. The code works because it addresses fundamental human mechanics. But I want to address a potential counter-argument here.
Okay, let's hear it.
We've spent this deep dive talking about the electricity of the physical room at Water Street, the weeping, the blunt language, the physical act of washing in the bathhouse. It is easy to see how a passionate, crowded room in Hell's Kitchen transforms a person face to face.
Right, there's a tangible energy there. It's visceral.
But how does ink on a page capture that same electric transformation for a guy sitting completely alone in a silent prison library? I mean, a book isn't a warm room. It isn't a bowl of soup or a clean paper collar.
That's a really great question. Because you do lose the physical empathy of the space. You lose the community aspect.
So how does it still work? It works because the book itself becomes the credible messenger. The prisoner reading the text isn't reading a dry theological treatise written by a free, wealthy man who has never seen the inside of a cell.
He's not reading a textbook.
No. He is reading the internal monologue of a man who knows exactly what the cold stone of a prison feels like. The empathy is permanently embedded in the narrative structure. When Jerry's story says, "I was a convict and I found a way out," the ink on the page acts as a perfect proxy for the peer-to-peer testimony.
So the book itself is the peer.
Exactly. The prisoner isn't alone anymore. He's engaged in a silent dialogue with Jerry's history.
And the prisoner explicitly says in the text, "The book gave me courage." Not that it gave him a set of rules or a new theology, but courage. The courage to believe that his current reality wasn't his final destination.
Precisely. The McAuley model proved that hope is highly transmissible, even across time and space, provided the carrier of the hope is viewed as legitimate by the infected population.
So, synthesizing this journey for you, the listener, we started with a single, highly dangerous river thief, a man terrified of his own past who refused to exploit it. He translates that pain into a physical, architectural vision of a bath and a chapel.
A place of cleansing.
He establishes a brutally honest, nightly peer-to-peer storytelling movement. And that tiny, gritty room in the Fourth Ward becomes an incubator that launches an international network of rescue missions, boats with blue pennants, and books infiltrating solitary prison libraries across the globe.
It is a staggering legacy. It completely disrupted the top-down charitable models of the 19th century and proved, with empirical data, that the most powerful agents for massive social change are almost always the very people society has aggressively written off.
Which leaves us with a genuinely lingering, provocative thought to mull over today. In our modern era, social work and charitable intervention have become highly professionalized.
Very much so.
It's deeply academic, it's heavily bureaucratic, we have advanced degrees, licensing boards, massive systemic infrastructures, and pristine boardrooms designed to help people in need.
And it is crucial to state that those professional structures are important and do vital, necessary work. We aren't dismissing them.
Right, they serve a massive purpose.
But exploring the raw sociology of this text forces us to ask, what, if anything, have we lost by moving away from the Jerry McAuley model of raw, peer-led, deeply personal intervention?
That's the million-dollar question.
If the absolute most effective mechanism for saving a life is simply the unpolished, bleeding testimony of someone who was in the exact same pit yesterday, are we sometimes looking for solutions in the wrong places? Have we inadvertently replaced the credible messenger with the clinical observer?
That is the thought I want you to take away from this deep dive. Because when you look at a broken system or a broken person, the natural instinct is to want to fix it with the precision of an engineer.
We want a formula.
We do. We want the clean data. We want the boardroom, the marble, and the mahogany. We want the process to be sterile and controlled. But the legacy of Jerry McAuley proves that sometimes the only way to actually pull someone out of the muddy waters is to send someone who already knows exactly how to swim in the dirt.